You know, for more than 500 years, while huge empires were rising and falling all across the Indian subcontinent, one region, way up in the northeast, stayed fiercely independent. We're diving into the incredible story of Assam, a kingdom that built a legendary reputation for being, well, unconquerable.
So that's the big question, right? How did they pull it off? How did this one kingdom manage to turn back some of the most powerful armies of the era again and again? Well, their story, it kicks off with a massive invasion, a pretty ruthless general, and a brilliant, brutal plan.
All right, let's set the scene. The year is 1206. A guy named Muhammad bin Bakhtiyar Khilji, a famously tough Afghan military chief, has just taken over Bengal. Feeling pretty good about himself, he decides to turn his army east, towards what was then called Kamrup. And he's not messing around, he's got an army of 12,000 elite Turkish cavalry. These guys were basically the special forces of their day. Now, the local ruler, a man named King Prithu, was smart. He knew he couldn't win a straight-up fight against Khilji's cavalry, so he decided to do something genius and, frankly, absolutely brutal. He decided to turn the land itself into his most powerful weapon, using what we now call a scorched earth policy. And you gotta appreciate the planning here. This wasn't random. King Prithu had a four-step plan. First, let the enemy march deep into your territory. Lure them in. Second, as they're coming, you move ahead of them and destroy everything, every bit of food, every source of water. Third, just wait. Let starvation, thirst, and pure exhaustion do most of the fighting for you. And then finally, when they're at their absolute weakest, you launch your attack. And guess what? It worked. It worked perfectly. By the time Khilji's army, now starving and exhausted, finally met King Prithu's forces, they were just a shadow of their former selves. They were completely routed. And as the few survivors tried to flee, they found that the huge stone bridge they had crossed to get in, well, it was destroyed. Only a tiny handful, including Khilji himself, even made it out. The defeat was so humiliating that Khilji apparently spiraled into a depression and was later assassinated. By one of his own generals, no less. Ouch. Okay, so fast forward just a couple of decades from that first invasion. In 1228, a new dynasty shows up, coming in from Southeast Asia, the Ahoms. And these guys would go on to build an incredibly powerful kingdom over the next 600 years, becoming the main engine of resistance and perfecting the art of defending their homeland.
But here's the thing. Khilji's massive defeat, that wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. It was really just the opening act. The pressure on the region was constant. For centuries, different rulers and sultanates kept trying to invade. But as the Ahoms grew more and more powerful, an even bigger challenge was looming on the horizon.
So you might be wondering, what was the Ahom's secret sauce? How did they keep winning? Well, it was a whole mix of smart governance and military genius. For starters, they were way ahead of the curve with gunpowder, making their own cannons and guns. They became masters of naval warfare on the giant Brahmaputra River, built this amazing network of forts, and used guerrilla tactics to turn the forests and hills into a nightmare for any invading army. All right, so let's jump to the 17th century, because this is when the real Goliath of our story enters the scene, the mighty Mughal Empire. Under Emperor Aurangzeb, they were absolutely determined to finally bring this defiant kingdom to heel. This was going to be the ultimate David versus Goliath showdown. And to really get a sense of what the Ahoms were up against, you just have to look at the numbers. It's staggering. The Mughals put together a massive invasion force, and it started with 30,000 infantrymen. And that was just the infantry. On top of that, they brought almost 20,000 elite cavalry, 15,000 archers, and a navy of 40 huge warships. This was, without a doubt, a super army of its day, built for one thing: total conquest. The Ahoms were, impossibly outnumbered. Now, the Ahom general, a man named Lachit Bor Fukan, he knew facing this war machine on an open field was just suicide. So instead, he did something clever. He picked his battlefield. He lured the entire Mughal force to a very narrow part of the Brahmaputra River at a place called Saraighat. The final, decisive battle was going to be fought on the water. And this is where that home ingenuity really comes into play. See, their navy was made up of small, quick, agile boats that were perfect for the river's tricky currents. The Mughals, on the other hand, had these massive warships, basically floating fortresses, that were super powerful but really clumsy in that narrow channel. The Ahoms were planning to use the river itself as an ally. But then, right in the heat of battle, disaster. The Mughal fleet, with all its cannons, starts pushing the Ahoms back.
Panic begins to spread, and the Ahom boats actually start to retreat. And to make everything 1,000 times worse, their commander, Lachit Berfukhan, is on the shore on a sickbed, suffering from a really serious illness. It looked like it was all over. The battle, the kingdom, everything.
But Lachit, seeing his army start to break, did something that would go down in history. He had his men carry him, as sick as he was, onto one of his warboats. And as he was rowed right into the thick of the fight, he yelled this now famous line, basically saying, "My duty to my king and my people is way more important than my own life."
And you can just imagine the effect that had. Seeing their general, who was practically on his deathbed, leading the charge, it was like a bolt of lightning through the Ahom fleet. The retreat immediately turned into a furious counterattack. The small Ahom boats swarmed the giant Mughal warships, boarding them, overwhelming their crews. The Mughal navy was thrown into complete chaos. Their top admiral was killed, and just like that, the tide of the battle turned. It was a stunning, decisive victory against all possible odds. And just like that, the Battle of Saraighat became the stuff of legend. It was the ultimate proof that a smaller, smarter force, using its deep local knowledge and strategic genius, could absolutely defeat a seemingly invincible empire. This wasn't just another victory. It was the ultimate proof that the Ahom way of war worked. And they didn't stop there. About a decade later, in 1682, the Ahoms fought one last major battle and pushed the Mughals out of the region for good. The Manas River became the permanent border, a physical monument to a resistance that had lasted for centuries.
Okay, so the fighting's over, right? The Mughals are gone, but the story doesn't end on the battlefield. In fact, what happens next is, in some ways, even more interesting, because this long, violent history of conflict led to a really surprising legacy, not of division, but of cultural mixing. To really get this, we have to rewind, all the way back to that very first invasion in 1206 with Bakhtiyar Khilji. Remember all those soldiers who were taken prisoner? Well, King Prithu didn't execute them. He actually allowed them to settle down and live there peacefully. Think about that. The first Islamic communities in Assam started not because of a successful invasion, but because of a failed one. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. Over the centuries, this process of integration just kept going. New waves of Muslim migrants came, but they weren't soldiers. They were skilled artisans, families who were experts in Persian writing, masonry, stone carving, and weaving were welcomed into the Ahom kingdom, bringing all these incredible skills that just made the society richer. And we're not talking about minor contributions here. These communities became woven into the very fabric of Ahom culture. The largest Ahom royal palace, built by a Muslim architect named Ganesham. Some of the most famous illustrated manuscripts, the paintings were done by Muslim artists. And a revered Sufi saint named Azan Fakir created these beautiful devotional songs that blended Islamic and local traditions together, songs that people still cherish in Assam today. Which kind of brings us to the big takeaway here. The history of Assam is, yes, a powerful story about military resistance, but it's also this incredible story of cultural fusion. It shows how a society that was literally forged in constant conflict could also create this unique, lasting legacy of coexistence. So when you look at this whole 500-year saga, what does it teach us about resilience, about identity, and about how different cultures can come together, even in our own time?